us some money!
Okay, so after careful consideration, I've decided to do something a little different and post video reviews. For the most part, I've tried to avoid doing videos like this, save for my Discord and retrospectives, and tried to make my content more about broad topics that I can really get into the meat of. Whether it's about a series in its entirety or about specific aspects of that series that's worth talking about. Sadly, those kinds of think pieces can take a little while to make as I need time to evaluate and reevaluate the script to ensure my thesis is as cohesive as can be. Sometimes I've had to revise an entire script after having worked on it for months. As such, I've decided that you guys deserve something that can safely put in between those stretches of time with regular episode reviews. And what better way to kick off this new approach than with the Owl House? Now, this will be different from my Discord and retrospectives, as I won't be reviewing the series in chunks, but rather on an episode-by-episode basis. I know it's been a while since the first season wrapped up, and we still haven't got an official release date on season 2, but I think having that time to reflect on the first season in full and the context it provides will make my journey through each episode even more worthwhile. This shouldn't be extremely difficult for me, and on the off chance that an episode is sparse in the ways of something to talk about, I'll just combine that episode with the one after it for the sake of length. Get it? Got it? Good. So we shall begin with the beginning. A Lying Witch and a Warden. A premiere that almost immediately sold me on the main protagonist, Luz Noceda, and the magical adventure that awaits her in the show. I've already done a full video on Luz's character, so I'll try not to repeat myself too much here, but I think it's important to stress that I love her. I love her energy, her eccentricities, the way she's the poster child for fandom kids who grew up in the age of the internet.
I like editing anime clips to music and reading fantasy books with convoluted backstories.
And also, I really like her design. Something about it just screams Digimon Adventure for me. In fact, the setup for the show is kind of like Digimon Adventure now that I think about it. Kid gets taken away from summer camp into a fantastical world full of monsters and dangers. Only instead of this being an act of destiny, it's just a freak accident. Hopefully. Now, I wouldn't say Luz is the kind of kid I was growing up. Sure, I was a fandom girl in my youth, but I had a lot more anxiety and toxic masculinity to work through in this stage of my life. I was also an introvert. Luz, for all her demonstrated social ineptitude, is very much an extrovert. And it's those two almost paradoxical traits that end up getting her in trouble in school and being sent to conversion therapy, summer camp. With the context of the rest of the season, it's all the clearer that the only thing Luz needed to become the social butterfly she is by season's end were all those lessons and consideration she gets in her time on the Boiling Isles. Luz is an extremely extroverted individual who craves social interaction. It's just that her head is too densely stuffed in the clouds. Sure, she's a nerd, but she's not a shut-in. Shut-ins wouldn't be this enthusiastic about trying to get into theater or cheerleading. It's clear Luz wants to make friends, she just doesn't know how to do it, so she retreats to her fantasy worlds to cope. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not Camilla sending Luz to this camp was the right move or not, considering how utterly miserable Luz seems about the whole affair, but it's worth pointing out, again, that Luz was very much in need of a reality check at this point in the show. Her behavior is causing problems for the people around her, and in order for her to stop doing that, she needs to grow up a little. Since this is moments before she discovers the Boiling Isles are even a thing, this camp was probably the best thing for her. On that note, I still love how utterly sweet and unabusive Camilla is about the whole thing. She tells Luz exactly what's going to happen and why, but isn't nasty or demeaning about any of it. She's doing everything she can to help her daughter become comfortable with this whole arrangement. There's a bit in this scene where Luz places her Azura book in the trash while her mother is talking. If the show was going to frame Camilla as a negligent or abusive parent, they probably would have shown her throwing the book in the trash herself, or else just telling Luz to do it. But she doesn't. There is literally nothing about this first episode to suggest that Camilla is a bad mother aside from audience projection, or just being unable to see Latina mothers as anything other than a violent stereotype. Simply put, y'all got some issues you need to work out. She's a good mom, and I love that she's a good mom. But anyway, enough about that real world crap. Let's go to Halloween Town, the Boiling Isles. See, one of the most appealing things about fantasy stories is the promise of fantastical environments. But a lot of bog standard fantasy stories tend to interpret that as just medieval Europe, because those writers have about as much imagination as a single thumbtack. So when we see the Boiling Isles, a cavalcade of horrors and monstrosities that have built their civilization upon the literal rotting corpse of a titan, it is remarkably refreshing. And we get a clear look at that in this episode alone. Right off the bat, good fantasy world. Mwah. Speaking of Ida, the Step on Me Owl Lady. If I hadn't seen any promotional material about the Owl House before going in, Ida's introductory scene would have sold me on this show alone. Here we see her being a badass and snarky older woman who's just doing what she can to make a living while also living and breathing punk rock, and let me tell you, I was living for it. As this is her introduction, she doesn't quite have the same mom energy she would have by season's end, but it's still clear she does take a degree of responsibility over Luz, even if she strong-arms her into a rather dangerous situation. And it's clear that she cares about those close to her considering the lengths she goes to for her friend's dumb little paper crown. I'll stop myself from gushing too hard about her as I've already done that, but safe to say, favorite character, full stop. Real quick, before we continue, I just need to make one thing clear. In this scene, Luz and Ida get vored by a house. Thank you. Back to the review. Then, not too long after, we get introduced to King, a character I actually found myself liking more than I thought I would. Not to say I ever expected to dislike King, but rather I expected him to just kinda be there. But this wouldn't be the Owl House if it wasn't exceeding my expectations, so King ended up being endearing and adorable in his first outing, and I am extremely thankful for that. I know the lore nerds are wondering whether his mantra about being the king of demons is something that actually is the thing that happened, or if it's just a vehicle for a series of jokes that started with this whole crown fiasco. I'm not exactly passionate about either one of these possibilities, frankly. I'm more concerned about the show being entertaining than just being a lore dump. Now, that isn't to say that King actually being a mighty ruler of demons back in the day couldn't be entertaining, but regardless, it's pointless to speculate on it now. That said, if we do see King being returned to some sort of formal glory, I would love to see him voiced by Keith David. That would be fun. Anyway, we get to the jailbreak segment in the third act, and subsequently the theme of this episode. Us weirdos have to stick together. It is here that the episode draws some pretty heavy parallels between the conformatorium and the summer camp that Luz was almost sent to. As I said, the execution in this is a little clumsy because we did get a small montage of Luz's quirks being incriminatingly destructive to her fellow schoolmates not 20 minutes ago. By contrast, the inmates in here engage in behavior far more mundane and harmless. The most you could say that's wrong with them is this guy practicing self-harm when he eats his own eyeballs. But even then, they grow back. That'd be like if I was sent to a psych ward for eating my own hair after I cut it. Sure, it's weird, but it's not hurting anybody, not even me. The comparison kind of falls flat when you account for the action-punishment ratio here. I can see why they framed the episode like this, of course. It's the series premiere and they're trying to sell the audience on the reason Luz makes the decision to stay in the admittedly hellish Boiling Isles, instead of just going back home the first chance she gets. And the rest of the season runs slightly anathema to this clunky theme anyway, so there's no lasting damage. Anyway, onto a bit in this episode that did end up becoming a trend in future episodes, lore dumps that end up just being the punchline for jokes. The adventure to the conformatorium starts with the objective of finding King's crown of power and restoring him to his former strength. Near the episode's end, we find it's just a simple paper crown that King wears just to feel better about himself. I love this, and I love how it becomes a trend in the show. I love anything that goes against the typical conventions of gentrified fantasy that tries to make it all about the world rather than the characters. There might be people who see this episode and obsess about pointless questions like, what actually happened to King's power, or how did the Warden Wrath create a barrier that only humans can step through, and conveniently ignoring the actual answer to that question. Who actually cares? It's not important to the story. The Owl House isn't the Silmarillion. It's a slice of life show with fantastical elements about a young girl learning some emotional maturity with found family thrown in for good measure. Plus, this punchline leads right into Ida's bit about the importance of doing right by the people you care for. Also, I like this bit.
You've always eluded our capture. You've always been the one who got away. I found that alluring.
I hate everything you're saying right now.
When you got Luz, the most fandom trope obsessed person in the room, calling out your toxic enemies to lovers bullshit, you know you fucked up. A little ironic considering how much ship teasing goes on between Luz and Amity later down the line, but it's important to show the kitty winks that there is indeed a line that shouldn't be crossed by your potential dating prospects. Stalking and beheading is most certainly past that line. Anyway, in the denouement, we see Luz deciding to stay in the Boiling Isles and learn how to be a witch from Ida. It's a good wholesome be gay, do witchcraft ending, but there's another reason I like it. At the start of the episode, we are shown very clearly that Camilla loves Luz very much and just wants what's best for her. Here at the end, we see that Luz really does love her mother too. It's shown very clearly that Luz wishes to use the Boiling Isles to escape summer camp, not her mother. Trying to get away from her mother was something that never came to Luz's mind, and it becomes a running plot point later down the line. Once again, it wouldn't have been difficult for Dana Terrace to make this show about a teen escaping an abusive household. There were several opportunities in this episode alone to make Camilla a bad mom, and the episode takes none of those opportunities. Considering how both Camilla and Luz are very clearly not white, I would consider this to have been a good call. The last thing we need in terms of representation is for people of color to be presented as having a toxic home life. So yeah, aside from some slight fumbling in the overall theme of this episode, this is one of the best series premieres I've seen in a long time of one of the best cartoons I've seen in a long time. After watching this my first time, I was hooked, and upon rewatching it, it's even better than I remember. It makes me enthusiastic about the rest of my rewatch, and I can't wait for you all to join my experience. We'll see you again in the next episode. Toodles!